Thomas Jefferson could cry out in words that echo across the centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. President Coles, members of the faculty and members of the student body of this great institution of learning, ladies and gentlemen, I need not pause to say how very delighted and honored I am to have the privilege and opportunity of coming to your community and coming to Bowdoin College, a college that I have known as one of the truly great institutions of our nation. It is always a rich and rewarding experience to take a brief break from the day-to-day demands of our struggle in the South and discuss the issues involved in that struggle with concerned people all over our nation. And so I can assure you that it is a pleasure to be here, and I want to express my personal appreciation to the committee for extending the invitation. That is a desperate question on the lips of people all over the nation and all over the world. I get it a great deal as I travel around, and I'm sure you are thinking of that question. It is a question of whether we are making any real progress in the area of race relations in our nation. And I think there are three possible answers that one can give to this question. There are three basic attitudes that can be taken toward the whole question of progress in race relations. First, that is the attitude of extreme optimism. Now, the extreme optimists in this area would point proudly to the fact that we have made meaningful strides in race relations over the last few years. And from this he would conclude that the problem is just about solved now, and that we can sit down comfortably by the wayside and wait on the coming of the inevitable. The second position that can be taken is that of extreme pessimism. The extreme pessimists would argue that we have made only minor strides in the area of race relations. He would contend that the deep rumblings of discontent all over the nation, the presence of federal troops in Little Rock, Arkansas a few years ago, and in Oxford, Mississippi, and Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and the birth of white citizens' councils are all indicative of the fact that we are retrogressing rather than progressing. And he would go on to contend that that is a white backlash at this present time, which means that we have created many more problems than we have solved in the area of civil rights. From this he would conclude that there can be no real progress in race relations and that this problem cannot be solved. It is very interesting to notice that the extreme optimists and the extreme pessimists agree on at least one point. They both feel that we should sit down and do nothing in the area of race relations. The extreme optimist says do nothing because integration is inevitable. The extreme pessimist says do nothing because integration is impossible. But that is a third position that can be taken, namely the realistic attitude. The realist seeks to combine the truths of two opposites while avoiding the extremes of both. And so the realist would agree with the optimist that we have come a long, long way, but he would seek to balance that by agreeing with the pessimist that we have a long, long way to go before this problem is solved. And it is this realistic position that I would like to use as a basis for our thinking together tonight as we think of the question of the future of integration. We have come a long, long way, but we have a long, long way to go before the problem is really solved. Now let us notice first that we have come a long, long way. And I think I could mention at this point that the Negro himself has come a long, long way in re-evaluating his own intrinsic worth. In order to illustrate this, a little history is necessary. You will remember that it was in the year 1619 when the first Negro slaves landed on the shores of this nation. They were brought here from the soils of Africa. And unlike the Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Plymouth a year later, they were brought here against their will. Throughout slavery, the Negro was treated in a very inhuman fashion. He was a thing to be used, not a person to be respected. He was merely a depersonalized cog in a vast plantation machine. The famous Dred Scott decision of 1857 well illustrated the status of the Negro during slavery. In this decision, the Supreme Court of our nation said in substance that the Negro is not a citizen of this nation, he is merely property, subject to the dictates of his own. And it went on to say that the Negro has no rights, that the white man is bound to respect. And with the growth of slavery, it became necessary to give some justification for it. It seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some thin rationalization to clothe an obvious wrong in the beautiful garments of righteousness. And this happened during slavery. Even religion and the Bible were used or misused to crystallize the status quo. And so it was argued from pulpits over the nation that the Negro was inferior by nature because of Noah's curse upon the children of Ham. The Apostle Paul's dictum became a watchword, servants, be obedient to your master. And then one brother had probably read the logic of the great philosopher Aristotle. You will remember that Aristotle did a great deal to bring into being what we now know as formal logic in philosophy. And in formal logic you have a big word that describes what is known as the syllogism, which has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And so this brother decided to put his argument in the framework of an Aristotelian syllogism. He came out with his major premise, all men are made in the image of God. Then came the minor premise, God, as everybody knows, is not a Negro. Then came the conclusion, therefore the Negro is not a man. This was the type of reasoning that prevailed. Well, living with the conditions of slavery and then later segregation, many Negroes lost faith in themselves, and many came to feel that perhaps they were inferior, perhaps they were less than human. But as events unfolded and developments took place, something happened to the Negro. Circumstances made it possible and necessary for him to travel more. The coming of the automobile, the upheavals of 2 world wars, the Great Depression. And so his rural plantation background gradually gave way to urban industrial life. And even his cultural life was gradually rising through the steady decline of crippling illiteracy. All of these forces conjoined to cause the Negro to take a new look at himself. Negro masses all over began to reevaluate themselves, and the Negro came to feel that he was somebody. His religion revealed to him that God loves all of his children, and that all men are made in his image, and that the basic thing about a man is not his specificity but his fundamentum, not the texture of his hair or the color of his skin, but his eternal dignity and worth. And so the Negro could now unconsciously cry out with the eloquent poet, "Fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. And were I so tall as to reach the pole or to grasp the ocean at a span, I must be measured by my soul. The mind is the standard of the man." With this new sense of dignity and this new self-respect, a new Negro came into being with a new determination to suffer and struggle and sacrifice in order to be free. And so in a real sense, we've come a long, long way since 1619. But not only that, if we're to be true to the facts, we must admit that the whole nation has come a long, long way in extending the frontiers of civil rights. 50 years ago, even less than that, 25 years ago, a year hardly passed when numerous Negroes, particularly in the South, were not brutally lynched by some vicious mob. Lynchings have about ceased today. 25 years ago, many methods were used to keep the Negro from becoming a registered voter. And one method used in several of the southern states was the poll tax approach. But now the poll tax has been eliminated in every state in the Union in federal elections as a result of a recent amendment to the Constitution. At the turn of the century, there were very few Negroes registered to vote in the South. By 1948, that number had leaped to 750,000. By 1960, it had leaped to 1,300,000. And since that time, we've registered about 700,000 within the last 3 years. And it stands now at about 2 million Negroes registered to vote in the South. Far from what it ought to be, but it does represent some strides, and it represents a little progress. If we look in the area of economic justice, we see some progress. The average Negro wage earner of today earns 10 times more than the average Negro wage earner of 12 years ago. And in a collective sense, we do see some changes in that the annual income of the Negro is now $27 billion a year, which is more than all of the exports of the United States and more than the national budget of Canada. This reveals that we've come a long, long way. But probably more than anything else, in any other area, we have seen the walls of legal segregation gradually crumble. Now, we all know the long history of legal segregation in our country. It had its legal beginning in 1896 when the Supreme Court rendered a decision known as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which established the doctrine of separate but equal as the law of the land. Now, of course, we all know what happened as a result of the Plessy doctrine. There was always a strict enforcement of the separate without the slightest intention to abide by the equal. The Negro ended up being plunged into the abyss of exploitation, where he experienced the bleakness of nagging injustice. Then something else happened. The Supreme Court of the nation decided to examine the legal body of segregation, and on May 17, 1954, it declared it or pronounced it constitutionally dead. And in that decision, it said in substance that the old Plessy doctrine must go, that separate facilities are inherently unequal, and that to segregate a child on the basis of his race is to deny that child equal protection of the law. And as a result of this decision, we've seen numerous changes. And following that decision, many other developments took place in nonviolent direct action, beginning with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 1956, the sit-in movement in 1960, the Freedom Rides in 1961, the Albany movement and others in 62, and the Birmingham movement and others in 63. And with all of these movements taking place, we have been able to see the walls of racial segregation gradually crumble. To put it figuratively in biblical language, we have broken loose from the Egypt of slavery. We have moved through the wilderness of legal segregation, and now we stand on the border of the promised land of integration. We've come a long, long way since 1896, and I'm absolutely convinced that the system of segregation is on its deathbed, and the only thing uncertain about it now is how costly the segregationists will make the funeral. We've come a long, long way. Now, this would be a wonderful place for me to end my talk tonight. First, it would mean giving a short speech, and that would be a magnificent accomplishment for a Baptist preacher. Secondly, it would mean that the problem is about solved in America, and it would be wonderful if everybody could talk about this problem as a problem that once existed but no longer has existence in our nation. But you see, if I stop at this point, I will merely be stating a fact and not telling the truth. You see, a fact is merely the absence of contradiction, but truth is the presence of coherence. Truth is the relatedness of facts. Now, it is a fact that we've come a long, long way, but it isn't the whole truth. And I'm afraid if I stop at this point, I will leave you the victims of a dangerous optimism. If I stop here, I will leave you the victims of an illusion wrapped in superficiality. So in order to tell the truth, it is necessary to move on and say not only that we've come a long, long way, but we have a long, long way to go, north and south, if this problem is to be solved in our nation. Now, we don't need to look very far to see that. We can only open our newspapers morning after morning and turn on our televisions day after day, and we can see in glaring terms that this problem is still with us. It may be true that lynchings have about ceased, but other things are happening just as bad. And we can still feel the effects of a Medgar Evers being murdered in Jackson, Mississippi last summer, or 4 young, unoffending, innocent Negro girls being murdered in a church in Birmingham, Alabama last September. And these things are still happening in our nation. And there are still legislative halls in the South ringing loud with such words as interposition and nullification. And then we notice the spectacle of a merchant of hate leaving his segregated base in Alabama, going over the nation, peddling the ugly commodity of racism, and getting in state after state a large number, as much as 30 and 32% of the votes. This reveals to us that we have a long, long way to go in our nation. I mentioned voter registration and the fact that we are making strides, but we must also notice the other side. And that is the fact that there are still more than 10 million Negroes living in the South. Of this number, some 6 million are eligible to vote, at least they are of voting age, and yet only about 2 million are registered. This means that there are 4 million Negroes in the South who are of voting age who are not registered. Now, some of this may be attributed to what we may refer to as internal apathy, but I suspect that most of it can be attributed to external resistance by certain forces in the South, determined to keep Negroes from becoming registered voters. And all types of conniving methods are still being used in many states to keep the Negro from becoming a citizen and becoming a registered voter. Complex literacy tests are still given with questions so difficult that a person with a law degree from the finest law schools of the nation could not answer to the even more difficult question, how many bubbles do you find in a bar of soap? They tell me occasionally in Mississippi and Alabama they ask questions like this. And this is an actual fact. Many conniving methods are used to keep Negroes from voting. In many instances, Negroes are threatened with physical violence and actually face physical violence when they seek to register to vote. In many instances, Negroes are victimized with economic reprisals when they seek to register and vote. And this is true all over the state of Mississippi and many areas of the state of Alabama and many areas of Louisiana and South Carolina and the state of Georgia and other southern states. This reveals that we still have a great deal to do in our nation to guarantee the fundamental right of citizenship, the fundamental right to vote. I mentioned economic justice and the fact that some strides had been made here. And I mentioned a big figure, that the Negro has an earning power now, a collective power of some $27 billion. That's a big figure. But we must look at the other side if we are to see the truth of the situation. 42% of the Negro families of America still earn less than $2,000 a year, while just 17% of the white families earn less than $2,000 a year. 20% of the Negro families of America earn less than $1,000 a year, while just 5% of the white families earn less than $1,000 a year. 88% of the Negro families of America earn less than $5,000 a year, while just 58% of the white families earn less than $5,000 a year. And the problem is getting even greater today because of certain forces alive in our nation and alive in the world. We face the fact that in many situations, the Negro has been and is still denied apprenticeship training because of discrimination in employment, because of discrimination in education. The Negro has been limited to unskilled and semi-skilled labor. And now in these days of automation, these are the jobs that are passing away. And so the Negro lives, say, in a city like Detroit, where he's 28% of the population, but some 70% of the unemployed. Or take a city like Chicago. The head of one out of every 4 families is unemployed. And this can be duplicated in all of the major cities of our nation. And it is becoming a real problem, and unless we have a vigorous retraining program, and unless the nation works in a vigorous, determined way to grapple with this problem, we are in for deeper social problems and darker nights of social disruption. So it reveals that even in the economic area, we have a long, long way to go. Now, I mentioned that we've made great strides in breaking down the barriers of segregation. But I must give the other side, and that is that segregation is still with us. Even though we've made some strides, we must face the fact that racial segregation is still alive in its legal de jure form in the South, and it's still alive in its subtle de facto forms in the North. And this is true in areas all over our nation. We must face the fact that even though it may be true, as I said, from a figurative point of view, that old man segregation is on his deathbed, history has proven that social systems have a great last-minute breathing power, and the guardians of the status quo are always on hand with their oxygen tents to keep the old order alive. And so segregation is still with us. But if democracy is to live, segregation must die. For segregation is a cancer in the body politic which must be removed before our moral health can be realized. And may I say to you this evening that we don't have long to solve this problem. I know there are those who are saying slow up. There are those who are saying to the Negro and his allies in the white community, you ought to cool off, you're pushing things too fast. They are saying adopt a policy of moderation. Well, if moderation means moving on toward the goal of justice with wise restraint and calm reasonableness, then moderation is a great virtue which all men of goodwill must seek to achieve during this tense period of transition. But if moderation means slowing up in the move for justice and capitulating to the undemocratic practices of the guardians of a deadening status quo, then moderation is a tragic vice which all men of goodwill must condemn. We can't afford to slow up. We have our self-respect to maintain, but even more than that, because of our love for America, we can't afford to slow up. We must face the fact that many people are watching. They're wondering what America will do in this area. The vast majority of the peoples of the world live in Asia and Africa. And for years, most of them have known the dark night of colonialism. They have been dominated politically, exploited economically, segregated and humiliated by foreign powers. But today they're gaining their independence by the millions. And they are saying in no uncertain terms that racism and colonialism must go. And they are saying that they will not respect any nation that will subject a segment of its citizenry on the basis of race or color. And therefore, in a real sense, the hour is late. The clock of destiny is ticking out, and we must act now before it is too late. The shape of the world today does not afford America the luxury of an anemic democracy. Now, I must hasten to say that we must not seek to solve this problem merely to appeal to Asian and African peoples. We must not seek to solve this problem merely to meet the communist challenge. In the final analysis, racial discrimination must be uprooted from American society because it is morally wrong. In the final analysis, we must get rid of segregation because it is evil and it is sinful. Segregation is wrong, to use the words of the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, because it substitutes an I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship and relegates persons to the status of things. So we must seek to solve this problem not merely because it is diplomatically expedient, but because it is morally compelling. And so the great challenge facing our nation today is to move on with determination to solve this problem and to end segregation and discrimination and to remove them from every area of our life. Now, I would like to mention some of the things that must be done if this problem is to be solved. First, I'd like to mention the role of the federal government because I think that's an important role. The federal government must play an important role if this problem is to be solved by standing up in a firm, forthright manner and protecting the rights of all of the citizens of this nation. Now, if the federal government is to do its job, we've got to get rid of one or two myths that are circulated all over the nation. And they are being circulated now a great deal. One is the myth of time. We hear this over and over again. The people who live with this argument contend that only time can solve the problem which we face in race relations. And so they would say to the Negro, just be patient and nice and continue to pray, and in 100 or 200 years this problem will work itself out. These are the people who live with the myth of time. The only answer that we can give to this myth is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And it may well be that the forces of ill will in our nation have used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And I'm convinced that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people who will bomb a church in Birmingham, Alabama, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Somewhere along the way we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so it is always necessary to help time and to realize that the time is always ripe to do right. Now, the other myth that is circulated, and it is circulated a great deal now during the civil rights debate, is the idea that legislation really can't solve the problem of segregation and discrimination. You've got to change the heart. And so the individuals who believe this would go on to say that until you change the heart, you aren't getting anywhere, and therefore the legislative process is a waste of time. Now, I guess that the person who believes this is at least getting at a half-truth, because if the problem is ultimately to be solved, men and women must come together in a brotherly manner, not merely because the law says it, but because it's natural and right. If we are to solve this problem ultimately, men must be obedient not only to that which can be enforced by the law, but men must be obedient to the unenforceable. And I realize this, but that is the other side. After we say this, we must go on to say, it may be true that you cannot legislate integration, but you can legislate desegregation. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law can't change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. And so it may be that even though the law cannot change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. And pretty soon after you change the habits, the attitudes will change, the heart will change, and the whole system will change. And therefore, that is a need for strong civil rights legislation now, all over this nation, in states and in communities on a local scale, and civil rights legislation from the federal government and through the legislative branch of the government. Now, that is a debate going on at this present moment in the Congress of our nation, in the Senate. We know what happened in the House. The bill was passed there largely unscarred, and it was a magnificent demonstration of bipartisan support. But now that bill is in the Senate, Things are different in the Senate. The rules are different. That is Rule 22, which has served for years as a legislative incinerator that has burned to ashes every strong and determined move toward civil rights legislation. It makes it possible for negative forces to talk and talk and talk endlessly until things are weakened. Now, there are 19 men in that Senate committed to the proposition of talking that bill down to the point that it will have no meaning. And they are seeking now not to defeat the whole bill, because they are realistic enough to know that there will be a civil rights bill in this session of Congress. They are seeking to so emasculate that bill with crippling amendments that it will have no meaning. And they will seek to weaken the bill at three basic points, three basic sections. The section dealing with ending segregation in public accommodations, the section dealing with equal employment opportunities, and the section dealing with cutting off federal funds in federally assisted projects where you have discrimination alive. These are the three sections that they will seek to weaken. But I'm convinced that these three sections are so important that I would rather see no civil rights bill at all than to see a civil rights bill devoid of these three core sections. And I think it is important for all men of goodwill in this nation to unite and mobilize their resources and make it clear through letter writing campaigns, through visits to Washington, and through other direct action programs that this civil rights bill must pass. For if it does not pass, the already ugly sore of racial injustice on the body politic may suddenly turn malignant, and our nation may well be inflicted with an incurable cancer that will destroy our political and moral health. The health of our nation is involved here, and everybody of goodwill must see this and stand up for it. It was on a sweltering afternoon last June that a young, vigorous, intelligent, sincere president stood before our nation and said in eloquent terms, "The issue of civil rights is not merely a political issue. It is at bottom a moral issue." And he went on to say, "It is as old as the Scriptures and as modern as the Constitution. It is a question of whether we will treat our Negro brothers as we ourselves would like to be treated." And on the heels of that great speech, he went and presented to Congress the most comprehensive civil rights package ever presented by any president of this nation. Since that day in June, our nation has known a dark day and a dreary night. For that same young president was cut down by an assassin's bullet on Elm Street in Dallas, Texas. I think the greatest tribute that America can pay to the late John Fitzgerald Kennedy is to see that this civil rights bill is passed without being watered down at any point. I think this is urgent. It is a marvelous opportunity, and it will mean so much for the nation. And so the federal government, through the executive, through the legislative, and through the judicial branch, has a great role to play in making democracy a reality in general, and civil rights a reality in particular. But I would not like to give the impression this evening that only the federal government has a role to play. Many other agencies, I wish I had time to go into them, but just to mention some, certainly religious institutions and bodies have a great role to play. And we must face the shameful fact, and I honestly admit it as a Christian minister, that the church has not done what it should do in this area. We must still face the fact at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, when we stand to sing in Christ, there is no east or west. We stand in the most segregated hour of America, and the most segregated school of the week is the Sunday school. But Thank God we're beginning now to shake the lethargy from our souls. Religious institutions all over are coming to see. Many ministers are coming to see. Clergymen of all of the major faiths are coming to see the necessity for taking a stand on this issue. And more, this must be done if the transition from a segregated to an integrated society is to be a smooth one. And I could go on to mention the need for leadership from liberals in the North and leadership from the moderates in the white South. Certainly this is a real need. Organized labor has not done what it could do, and that is a need for leadership from labor in a more significant way, and leadership from industry. But with all of these working together, I do not want to give the impression that freedom is some lavish dish that will be passed out on a silver platter while the Negro merely furnishes the appetite. If freedom is to be a reality for the Negro, he must work for it, he must struggle for it, he must be willing to sacrifice and suffer for it. And this is the meaning of the movement that has taken place all over our country today, both North and South. The Negro has come to see that if he is to be free, he must stand up for that freedom. This is the meaning of the nonviolent direct action movement. Now, I would like to say just a few words about this philosophy or this method of nonviolence, since it has played such a great role in our struggle over the last few years, and it has been the undergirding philosophy in so many communities across the South and over the nation. I'm still convinced that nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for freedom and human dignity. It has a way of disarming the opponent. It exposes his moral defenses. It weakens his morale, and at the same time, it works on his conscience. And he just doesn't know how to handle it. If he doesn't beat you, wonderful. If he beats you, you develop the quiet courage of accepting blows without retaliating. If he doesn't put you in jail, wonderful. Nobody with any sense loves to go to jail. But if he puts you in jail, you go in that jail and transform it from a dungeon of shame to a haven of freedom and human dignity. Even if he tries to kill you, you develop the inner conviction that there are some things so dear, some things so precious, some things so eternally true that they are worth dying for. And that is something about this kind of conviction and this kind of determination that disarms the opponent, and he doesn't know how to grapple with it. And secondly, this method says in substance that it is possible to struggle to secure moral ends through moral means. One of the great debates of history has been over the whole question of ends and means. And there have always been those individuals who argued that the end justifies the means. Sometimes whole systems of government have argued this, that the end justifies the means. I think this is one of the weaknesses, along with many others of communism. It is found right here that communism says in substance that any method is justifiable in order to bring about the goal of the classless society. This is where the nonviolent movement would break with communism or any other system that argues that the end justifies the means, because the end is pre-existent in the means. The means represent the ideal in the making and the end in process. And in the long run of history, destructive means cannot bring about constructive ends. And so it is wonderful to have a method of struggle which says that you can struggle to secure moral ends through moral means. Now, another thing about this method is this. It says that it is possible to struggle vigorously against an unjust system. Struggle with all of your might, all of the resources of your soul and your body, and yet not hate the perpetrators of that unjust system. Now, certainly we have not always achieved this, but this is nonviolence at its best, when you struggle against the evil system and yet maintain an attitude of active goodwill toward the perpetrators of that evil system. And so the love ethic can stand at the center of the non-violent revolution. Now, I always have to say what I mean by this, because people begin to wonder when you say love your oppressors. They begin to say, how is this possible? Well, certainly I'm not talking about emotional bosh, and I'm not talking about an affectionate emotion. I think it is nonsense to say to oppressed people that they must love their violent oppressors in an affectionate sense. It just isn't possible. I think the Greek language comes to our aid as we try to understand the meaning of love here. There are three words in the Greek language for love. One is the word eros. Plato talks about it a great deal in his dialogues. This is a sort of aesthetic love, a yearning for the realm of the divine on the part of the soul. It has come to us to be a sort of romantic love, and in this sense we all know about eros. We have experienced it and read about it in all of the beauties of literature. In a sense, Edgar Allan Poe was talking about eros. We talked about his beautiful Annabel Lee with the love surrounded by the halo of eternity. In a sense, Shakespeare was talking about eros when he said, love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. It is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempest and is never shaken. It is a star to every wandering bark. You know, I can remember that because I used to quote it to my wife when we were courting. That's eros. Greek language talks about phileo, which is another level of love. It's a sort of intimate affection between personal friends. This is a kind of reciprocal love. On this level, you love people because you like them. You love because you are loved. This is friendship. The Greek language comes out with the word agape. Agape is more than aesthetic or romantic love. Agape is more than friendship. Agape is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. Theologians would say that it is the love of God operating in the human heart. When one rises to love on this level, he loves a person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. And I think it is this kind of love which can guide us and lead us through this tense period of transition. And so in a way, this is what we've been able to say in the most difficult moments. We've been able to stand before our most violent opponents and say in substance, we will match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we will still love you. We cannot in all good conscience obey your unjust laws, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. And so throw us in jail, and we will still love you. Bomb our homes and threaten our children, and as difficult as it is, we will still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our communities at the midnight hours, and drag us on some way out on some wayside road, and beat us and leave us half dead, and we will still love you. But be ye assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer, and one day we will win our freedom. But we will not only win freedom for ourselves, we will so appeal to your heart and your conscience that we will win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. This is a message of nonviolence at its best. And this is what it means when one lives it. And so I believe by following this philosophy, we will be able to transform our nation. And it will help those of us who've been on the oppressed end of the old order to go into the new order which is emerging with the proper attitude. We will not seek to rise from a position of disadvantage to one of advantage, thereby subverting justice. We will not seek to substitute one tyranny for another. But I am convinced that a doctrine of black supremacy is as dangerous as a doctrine of white supremacy. And God is not interested merely in the freedom of black men and brown men and yellow men, but God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race. and the creation of a society where all men will respect the dignity and the worth of human personality. And so with all of these forces working together, I believe we can move on to that better day, and we can move on and make integration a reality in our country. We've come a long, long way. We have a long, long way to go, and I think we can go that additional distance. Now, may I say that this problem is not just a sectional problem, and I'm sure that each of us assembled here is aware of that. We are grappling with a national problem, and it is one thing for a white person of goodwill in the North to rise up with righteous indignation when a bus is burned with Freedom Riders in Anniston, Alabama, or when a church is bombed in Georgia or Alabama, or when a courageous James Meredith has to confront riotous conditions and seeking to go into the University of Mississippi. A white person of goodwill in the North must rise up with as much righteous indignation when a Negro cannot live in his neighborhood, when a Negro cannot get a job in his particular firm, or when a Negro cannot join his academic or professional society, his fraternity or her sorority. In short, if this problem is to be solved, there must be a sort of divine discontent all over the nation. There are certain technical words in every academic discipline that soon become stereotypes and cliches. And every academic discipline has its technical nomenclature. Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. This word is a ringing cry of modern child psychology. And certainly we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But I must say to you, as I come to my conclusion, that there are certain things within our nation and in the world of which I'm proud to be maladjusted, which I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to become adjusted to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. For in a day when Sputniks and explorers are dashing through outer space and guided ballistic missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere, no nation can win a war. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence. And the alternative to disarmament, the alternative to a greater suspension of nuclear tests, the alternative to strengthening the United Nations and thereby disarming the whole world may well be a civilization plunged into the abyss of annihilation. I guess there's need for the formation of a new organization in the world, the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. That is a need for creative maladjustment, men and women who will be as maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of the injustices of his day could cry out in words that echo across the centuries, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream," as maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who had the vision to see that this nation could not survive half slave and half free, as maladjusted as Thomas Jefferson, who in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery could scratch across the pages of history words lifted to cosmic proportions. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As maladjusted as Jesus of Nazareth, who could say to the men and women of his generation, "He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword." Through such maladjustment, we will be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. And so with this kind of determined push and this kind of dedication and this kind of concern for the greatness of our nation, I believe firmly that we can solve this problem. I still have faith in the future. The days are now difficult, and the moments are now dark, but I still sing with those who are singing it by the thousands now in the theme song of our movement, "We shall overcome." And I believe this because somehow the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth-crushed earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. With this faith, we will be able to adjourn the councils of despair and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. With this faith and this determination, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day right here in this land when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." Thank you.